I love a philosophical thought experiment, and I also love a tier list. So I asked one of my philosophically minded friends to send me a list of some of the most interesting thought experiments he could find so that I can rank them. I'll be doing this unscripted and unprepared just because I think it's a bit more fun that way, but any corrections will be in a pinned comment and in the description. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. Okay, here we have the Mary knowledge argument. This is an incredibly famous thought experiment from the philosophy of mind that I'm sure that many of you will have come across before. I've talked about it on the channel before, so I won't spend too much time on this. But just to kind of catch anyone up, the Mary knowledge thought experiment comes from a dualist or ex-dualist philosopher of mind called Frank Jackson. And the idea essentially is to establish that there is something about the qualitative experience of seeing the world or experiencing the world that cannot be captured in merely physical terms. And thus the idea is that you have established some kind of non-physicalism. It's told through a story. So we are asked to imagine a colorblind scientist called Mary. And Mary, by stipulation, knows all of the physical facts about color vision, though of course she has never seen color herself. Sometimes this is, Mary's in a black and white room or something like that. There are different ways that you can set this up. But anyway, the point is that Mary knows everything physical about color vision, but one day she either gains color vision herself or steps outside the black and white room and she sees an object for the first time, sees a red object for the first time. Does she gain any new knowledge is the question that Jackson asks. And the knowledge component here is quite important because the idea is if she has new knowledge, then what's that knowledge about? Well, the knowledge is about the fact of what it is like to experience this color vision, right? This new thing, this redness that she's now experiencing. And then we might ask, what is that knowledge about? Well, it can't be about a physical fact. It can't be about something physical because we've just seen that Mary already, by stipulation, knew all of the physical facts about color vision. Therefore, it must be about something non-physical. Therefore, there must be some kind of non-physical component to qualia, this what its likeness that often comes up in the philosophy of mind. Now, I've been pretty critical of this thought experiment in the past. The original guy who came up with it, Frank Jackson, no longer believes in it. He doesn't think this works anymore. I can't exactly remember why he doesn't think this works anymore, but I think that there are independently pretty good objections to this thought experiment and indeed to thought experiments that are a bit like it, some of which we might come on to later. So my broad objection to this is that there's some real lack of clarification as to what knowing all the physical facts actually consists in. And I don't think this is actually a problem with the way that the thought experiment is described. I think it's just that we don't know what knowing all of the physical facts about color vision would be. We don't even know, for example, if we would still be even using the same kind of vocabulary that we now use to describe, neuroscience and psychology. We may be using an entirely different, there may have been in kind of Kuhnian terms, there may have been a total paradigm shift, comparable to how the study of life used to kind of revolve around this idea of vitalism, that there's this kind of élan vital, this vital stuff that separates living matter from dead matter. And of course, it's not that we explained what that was. It's that as we knew more and more about what life consists in, this concept of vital stuff just kind of dropped out of our language. It's not that it got solved as such. It's that it kind of got dissolved as time goes on. I think we do have good reason to suspect that neuroscience generally is a science very much in its early stages. I mean, I'll double check this actually, because I've got my iPad here. But the first MRI scan, if I remember correctly, was only conducted in the 90s. When was the first fMRI scan used? Yeah, 1991. So, about 9 years before I was born. And, I think that kind of puts into perspective just how young neuroscience is and how young our neuroscientific vocabulary and descriptions is. And likewise for things like psychology. Although obviously psychology is a much older field, it's still relatively young. And I sometimes think that when we dismiss what neuroscience could possibly do in the future, what it could possibly make possible in terms of explanation and description in the future, I kind of think it's a little bit like, say you lived 50 years after Aristotle first published physics, his book on physics, which in many ways, it didn't like inaugurate the field on a global scale. There have been loads of kind of physicists, but it's like it's a relatively helpful, like landmark moment in the history of kind of Western physics, let's say. And it would be a bit like if you lived kind of 50, 60 years after that, and you were like, right, yeah, but, physics will never be able to do this, and physics will never be able to do that. And you were like really pessimistic about the future of physics. I sort of think that we're in a similar position with neuroscience, right? Just as no one thousands and thousands of years ago could even guess what modern physics would look like, I think we're in kind of a similar position. I don't think that we can really have a good guess at what neuroscience will be able to do or tell us in 100, 200, certainly in 1,000 years' time, right? I just think that it's not necessarily that I think that neuroscience definitely will, quote unquote, explain consciousness. Though, of course, what that job consists in is kind of its own area of disagreement. But what I am pretty keen to caution against are grand proclamations about what what neuroscience definitely won't be able to do on the basis of intuitions that I just don't necessarily think are all that reliable. In this case, I think that they're unreliable because it seems like our intuition about what knowing all the physical facts will be able to do and what knowledge that will consist of is really only as good as our grasp on what a completed neuroscience would do and what that would look like. And I just don't think we have any reason to suspect that we have good, reliable ideas as to what that would be, I sometimes use an example from Frege to illustrate this, where Frege talks about how among certain ancient peoples, I think it might have been the Ionians, but don't quote me on that. I'm not entirely sure. Some kind of Greek, like subset of Greeks. They thought that Venus was two different planets. They thought that it was Hesperus and Phosphorus, the morning star and the evening star. And I don't know which way around those are. I wish I knew. I wish I spoke ancient Greek or indeed had looked this up before I started recording, but I hadn't. And if you were to ask one of these people, if you were to probe their intuitions about Hesperus and Phosphorus, you were to ask them something like, can Hesperus and Phosphorus be in different places at the same time? Well, they would say yes, because their intuitions have been shaped by the prior belief that Hesperus and Phosphorus are two distinct objects. And we now know that they would be wrong. And I kind of think that within that, there's a sort of lesson about the utility of our intuitions being only as good as the knowledge and background conditions that shape those intuitions. And I think here we have pretty good reason to think that, well, it's not that we have pretty good reason to think that our intuitions are unreliable. It's that we don't have much positive reason to think that our intuitions about what a completed neuroscience would look like would be reliable. And I think that as a result, that really quite crucial premise that the Mary knowledge argument rests on just doesn't get the grasp or the kind of epistemic weight that I think it would need in order to definitively say something like there is definitely a non-physical component to consciousness. So yeah, that's kind of my broad gloss on the Mary knowledge argument. There are, of course, responses to that and responses you can give to that. Most famously, Kripke said that this kind of argument this kind of unreliability of intuitions argument, the Hesperus Phosphorus stuff, doesn't work in the case of consciousness because consciousness and conscious states are defined by that intrinsic qualia. So those are kind of ineliminable, and as a result, we should really kind of rest on that. And the Hesperus Phosphorus case is kind of importantly disanalogous. Or disanalogous. Is it disanalogous or disanalogous? I don't know. That kind of always trips me up. I feel like I go for a different one each time I reach for the word. But that's kind of Kripke's argument. I just disagree with that. But yeah, there's a whole kind of separate debate that rages here. The Mary knowledge argument has been incredibly influential, but I ultimately just don't find it particularly persuasive. I think that's a good one to go in the B tier, I think, because on the one hand, you would struggle to find more influential thought experiments, especially within the philosophy of mind. But on the other, I just don't think it works. I'd be interested to know what people think, because some people find this kind of thing very, very persuasive. And, I've talked to people who find this thought experiment very persuasive. Philip Goff finds it pretty persuasive. Obviously, Alex and I often meet up and chat, and we invariably talk about consciousness, and he certainly thinks this is at least a better argument than I think it is. But yeah, I think B tier is a good way to kind of square all of those independent properties. Over on Substack, the Unsolicited Advice reading group are reading Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. If you'd like to join us, the link is in the description. Right, here's an incredibly influential ancient thought experiment that I'm sure that many of you will have heard of, the ship of Theseus. The construction of this thought experiment sort of goes roughly as follows. There's a guy called Theseus, and he has a ship, appropriately considering the name of the thought experiment. And every month, let's say, Theseus takes a bit of wood from his ship and he replaces it with a new bit of wood as part of the general maintenance that you probably do to ancient maritime vessels. And he takes those old bits of wood and he puts them in his warehouse, and gradually, over the course of many years, he replaces every single piece of his ship. So there's not a single material atom in that ship that has not been replaced. Now, at each point when Theseus replaces a plank, we would say, okay, yeah, this is still the same ship, right? One of the planks is different, but the ship is still fundamentally the same. And, as he continues to do this, we would still say, yeah, the ship it's the same ship, it's the same ship. And even after all of the planks has been replaced, we would tend to say, yeah, right, that's the same ship. It's the ship of Theseus. It's Theseus's ship. But then what would happen if we took all of those old planks and we assembled the ship again, out of these old material parts? Well, we'd probably want to say that too is the ship of Theseus. But then this is a problem, right? Because of what's called the transitivity of identity, which means that if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. This means that since the original ship of Theseus equals both the replacement part ship of Theseus and the original part ship of Theseus, we would end up inferring that the two ships that now exist distinctly are in fact the same object, and thus a kind of paradox emerges. This has been the inspiration for all sorts of problems to do with the identity of objects. The ship of Theseus is a very interesting one because obviously, it's a very cool image. However, I do think this is kind of the weakest version of identity-based thought experiments for a few reasons. I think that when it comes to artifacts, like non-conscious stuff, I think that it's very easy to just say that, when we talk about identity, we're just making a kind of pragmatic label, right? We're not saying that this ship is identical to that ship in any heavyweight sense. What we mean when we say that the replacement part ship is the same as the original ship is that there just is continuity. It is functionally the same. Theseus is using it in all the same ways. It retains a kind of legal ownership over it. In terms of kind of continuity of function, that is the ship of Theseus. Then when we assemble all of the old parts of the ship that have been stored in the warehouse, we want to say that that's identical to the old ship as well, but it's identical in a different sense. It's materially identical. So what appears to be a paradox just isn't that worrying upon further examination. I kind of go into this. I'm writing a video at the moment that I'm about 2/3 of the way through on later Wittgenstein and what he considered to be pseudo-problems in philosophy, specifically looking at the work of a Wittgenstein scholar called Paul Horrich, who's just fantastic. And Wittgenstein was very famous for, both in his early and his later philosophy, for thinking that many philosophical problems are confusions of language. And I think that the ship of Theseus is just a very good example of this, where evidently it seems that what's going on here, or evidently to me at least, I'm sure that many of you will disagree, what appears to be going on here is that we are just using two different senses of the word identity that have kind of two different heuristics underpinning them. The first heuristic is just that if there's sufficient continuity between two objects separated between two different kind of time points, so object at time t1 and object at time t2, if they are sufficiently continuous with one another in terms of their properties, then we will say that they're identical. Or they're the same object for our purposes. And then the other kind of heuristic that's applying to the kind of reassembled ship is that if two objects share all of the same materials, then they are also the same object, right? But that we ought not to take this kind of language too seriously and start positing about whether these really are the same objects. We need to think about things like identity in this context as like, tools, right? This is a tool that we're using to helpfully say that two objects are the same in some sense that should not be taken to have any kind of deep metaphysical significance behind it. And what happens here is that two different senses of the word identical come apart, and we are confused because we are treating our word identical as if it is kind of mapping onto something ontological, as opposed to just like a pragmatic tool-based way of using a word. I think that's like that's my solution to the ship of Theseus problem, which is a very like pragmatist and clearly kind of late Wittgensteinian influenced solution, though late Wittgenstein would put it quite differently considering his own thoughts about language. But I think as a solution that works. I think that actually our next thought experiment is kind of it's almost the ship of Theseus thought experiment, but it is, I find it so much more troubling and also find it so much more compelling. These are a kind of series of thought experiments that I'm going to group under the Derek Parfit identity thought experiments. Derek Parfit was a kind of giant of philosophy who wrote a very interesting book called Reasons and Persons that I haven't read in a while, but I read as an undergrad. And there are a couple of thought experiments here that I'm going to treat as a pair. Oh, sorry, God, I forgot to rank the ship of Theseus. I'm going to put the ship of Theseus in the C tier. Purely because I just don't think it works. I think it genuinely just is a pseudo problem. So despite its fame, I think it's got to be bumped down. But Derek Parfit, back onto him, because he's honestly a very, very fascinating thinker. He has a series of Theseus-esque thought experiments, but instead to do with personal identity. So one of his most famous ones is the kind of the teletransporter or teleport thought experiment, whereby you get into a teleporter on Earth and you are zapped, kind of, all of your body and brain and stuff is disintegrated, and then you are reassembled out of entirely different atoms on Mars. Say we've traveled to Mars at that point. And Parfit kind of asked the question, so like, did you survive that? Or did you just die and a copy of you was made? And, one reason to think that it might be the latter, I can't remember if Parfit himself goes down this route because, he has his own theory of identity that's incredibly interesting. But we don't have time to discuss it in too much detail here. One thing that might make you think that what's happened here is death is that imagine that that information, the information of your physical and chemical makeup was transported over to Mars, and because of a glitch in the teleporter, two versions of you appeared. Two copies of you were reassembled out of those atoms. Which one would be you? Which one would be like the you that is continuing the experience that you're having now, right? When you go to sleep and you wake up again, there's a kind of continuity of experience, a felt internal continuity of experience there. Which one of the teleported versions of you is the correct one? I don't know. I find this kind of thought experiment just like a much more interesting version of the kind of ship of Theseus thought experiments, partly because at base level, it doesn't differ too much from ship of Theseus style thought experiments. I still basically think intellectually that it's a kind of confusion of language type thing. But there's something about it that's so much more troubling, right? Like if you were to ask me whether I would get in a teleporter, I think I'd just say no. Because I don't know whether it would just kill me. And maybe that just shows that I'm kind of too trapped in a particular way of conceiving of the world. But like until I find a way to not just intellectually but kind of emotively break out of that way of looking at the world, then I just think that I wouldn't get in the teleporter. I think that another interesting series of identity-based thought experiments that Parfit toys with is the sorry about that, my mic ran out of battery, so I had to pop to Tesco to get some more. But where were we? I think we were looking at the second example of a Derek Parfit originated identity-based thought experiment, which is actually something that he borrowed from Bernard Williams and then I think made a kind of very interesting version of. So Bernard Williams is criticizing a view of personal identity whereby what makes you the same you as you were 5 years ago, what kind of holds that identity together is that you share kind of continuity of psychological states. So you share, continuity of memories, continuity of like personality traits, that kind of thing. There's like there is a kind of an evolution out of that earlier stage to the later stage, which is now you. That's the view that Bernard Williams is going to be critiquing. And it's a view that Parfit holds, though he holds a much more kind of sophisticated version of that, essentially. And Bernard Williams poses a particular thought experiment, which isn't technically one we're covering, where he says, okay, well, if what matters is psychological continuity, then imagine that you were being held captive by a torturous surgeon. And the surgeon says, I'm going to operate on you without any anesthetic. But before I do that, I'm going to flip this switch. I'm going to replace all of your memories and all of your kind of psychological characteristics with Napoleon's that I have kind of, he's nefariously got his hands on Napoleon's mind somehow. Bernard Williams asks, would this make you less nervous to undergo this torturous anti-anesthetic surgery? And he suggests that it probably wouldn't, right? And I can kind of see where that's coming from there. It's very hard to shake the fact that, or shake the idea that if somebody were to tell me that, I would continue to be quite nervous. And then Bernard Williams says, well, if we're analysing our concept of personal identity, at the very least, this suggests that there's something there that isn't covered under the continuity account. And then Parfit does something he kind of turns this into a gradable thought experiment, whereby rather than a switch being flipped and you becoming kind of psychologically Napoleonic, you are, 1% of you is being replaced by Napoleon, and then 2% of you is being replaced by Napoleon. And Parfit's kind of asking, well, Parfit asks a number of things. He's quite a kind of prodigious guy, it kind of intellectually. I don't know, maybe he was prodigious physically as well, but it's not information I've got memorized. So Parfit, anyway, one of the uses he has for this kind of what we might call a kind of gradable case. He compares it to the Sorites paradox, kind of gradable case of identity shift, I suppose, is that Parfit's point is, well, it doesn't really seem like there's a fact of the matter, like a definite point at which that person becomes Napoleon as opposed to being themselves beforehand. It seems like this is a kind of gradual thing. And Parfit's using this to support an idea of identity where there's no fixed one thing called personal identity that kind of, you're identical to you one day and then you're not the next. He says that this is all a bit misleading. He instead defines a relation, a kind of continuity relation that just does all of the work of personal identity. But importantly, that is gradable. It's no longer an on-off switch. I don't know if I explained that entirely correctly. Like, Parfit's point is that when we think of personal identity and when we ask identity questions like, is this person the same as this other person they were 2 years before, we are framing the question unhelpfully. That on-off switch question can be dissolved into a more sophisticated type of question whereby we ask to what extent there is this continuity between this earlier person and this later person. And yeah, so Bernard Williams obviously disagrees with that, but we don't have time to get too far into the weeds of his position here. I just wanted to give his view in order to then be able to give Parfit's view. And I think this is an incredibly cool kind of thought experiment, that's specifically the sort of Sorites-y gradable personal identity one, because I think it does like important dissolving work. I think that we are limited a lot of the time, actually, in philosophy, when we necessarily treat questions as binary, when it seems like a gradable approach could be just as helpful and potentially may even dissolve or kind of unteeth. Declaw's so much better than unteeth. Might declaw the bite. Oh, now really am mixing my metaphors, but declaw the impact of these philosophical problems, and I think Parfit's thought experiments do that very well. So I'm going to put specifically for this last one, I'm going to put Parfit's identity-based experiments in the S tier. I'm much fonder of this gradable one than I am the teletransporter or teleporter one, just because I love gradability in philosophy. I think we don't do it nearly enough, especially considering that gradability in adjectives is just totally ubiquitous. So yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I also think that this just touches upon a very important question, right? It really personal identity and specifically personal identity in this gradable sense, I think is a question that just kind of is of intense everyday import. So we quite often say, when we are forgiving someone or when we're letting go of an action that someone has done, you're not the same person you were when you did that, right? People use that when they say that. Say they had a very bad relationship with their parents and they're forgiving their parents later down the line after kind of evidence of behavior change. We say things like, you're not the same person. And I think that the role of kind of continuity of person and personality in like moral and in a kind of everyday, just kind of ground level, non-philosophical, ethical talk is really important. And I think that having a more nuanced idea of personal identity helps us navigate that part of our lives much better. I think this is actually a very good example of where shifting a philosophical position can have a very interesting practical import. And to that extent, I think that it is, philosophy done well. I like it when philosophy has a practical import in the world. Okay, next up we have the utility monster. This is a thought experiment stroke objection to utilitarianism that I think was first created by Robert Nozick. But I can't imagine that there weren't precursors to this. It's part of the whole family of objections to utilitarianism that attempts to create a scenario whereby it is stipulated that the greatest net happiness is being created, but that nonetheless it seems like something is wrong here. So the idea is that, it's not. This shows that utilitarianism is not capturing the full richness of our ethical intuitions, I suppose, is the idea. I think that intuitions are more appropriate to reach to in ethics than they are in other philosophical fields. Primarily because I'm a kind of an anti-realist regarding ethics, I conceive of ethics as a field of study as largely an attempt to systematize and make work these intuitions. So I think it makes a lot more sense there. But anyway, the idea is that a creature is stipulated called the utility monster, and the utility monster is much more capable of feeling happiness and suffering than we are. Sometimes this is put as it is more efficiently generating utils, which is like a kind of an abstract measurement that philosophers sometimes appeal to reference a kind of utilitarian factor, be that pleasure, as in kind of hedonic utilitarianism, or the satisfaction of strength of desire in preference utilitarianism. And you can kind of do this for all of the little variants of utilitarianism. But the idea essentially is that this is feels these emotions that utilitarianism wants to maximize to a far greater extent than you or I or any human would. Sometimes even to the point where it feels more than the whole of humanity put together. So a kind of hedonic leviathan almost. And the conclusion that one ought to draw if one is a consistent utilitarian is that this creature's needs and wants and emotions matter so much more than individual humans and perhaps even the entire human race put together. And, Nozick's point, and also the way this is often used generally, is that this is obviously undesirable. This is not what you want out of an ethical system, that you would sacrifice the entire well-being of the human race to a kind of hedonic leviathan. That's the objection that's being used. As I say, in terms of structure, it's very similar to many other objections to utilitarianism, like the idea, a kind of reverse utility monster is the objection to utilitarianism that says, well, yeah, in this case, it would be right to, torture an innocent person for the kind of amusement of a million psychopaths or something like that. That's kind of a mirror image of this objection, right? It's saying that the aggregation of happiness in utilitarian theories is unacceptable, and the kind of utility monster one is also saying that the aggregation in terms of just feeling is undesirable in utilitarianism. That's the idea. That's kind of how the objection works. If you were to ask me a few years ago, I would have placed this fairly low down on the tier list. If you were to ask me 10 years ago, I'd probably place it quite low down, although I wouldn't have come across many other thought experiments then, because I would have been 60. But I think that in recent years, this has become a much more live issue because although, large language models as they exist are definitely, well, I say definitely, they're almost certainly not conscious, right? Like as far as our best evidence points to them not being conscious and not having conscious experiences. But I do think that as, computing gets more sophisticated, I don't have a kind of an in-principle objection to there being artificial minds. And the kind of objections to the concept of artificial minds, I think, are generally quite weak. You have to argue that kind of for quite a strong form of substrate dependence, which is the idea that consciousness is inherently dependent on like certain, like the particular biological matter, and as a result, you could never have kind of non-biological consciousness. I don't find the arguments there very convincing, but the one interesting implication of creating artificial consciousnesses, or the potential to create artificial consciousnesses, is that you could, in theory, have an artificial consciousness that feels much more deeply than we do, especially if it's something that we designed. Say like in 80 years' time, we had a way of programming emotions that we kind of all concede is genuinely gives rise to emotional states that are analogous to human emotional states. Well, it seems to me, from my non-computing brain, that you could just keep multiplying whatever that is and create these artificial beings that feel to a much greater extent than we are. And two, potential worries you might have there. One is just the utility monster worry again, is that these beings would have desires that under utilitarianism would matter much more than human desires. But also, secondly, there's do you have an obligation to just create loads of these and just, make them as happy as possible? Simulate hedonic bliss? And that kind of mixes the utility monster objection to utilitarianism with an entirely different one called the repugnant conclusion that we're not going to get into today. So no, I think this has become more relevant now. I would place it in maybe on the cusp of the B and A tiers. I think that it is a pretty persuasive objection for a lot of people. But as I said, I think that when it comes to ethics, I'm an anti-realist. So these thought experiments, I think, are very useful, but I see them largely as internal deliberations. I don't see this as an objection to the truth of utilitarianism. I see it as an objection to us wanting to take it on as a totalizing ethical system. And I think it works very well there. So yeah, B and A tier. I think this is an interesting thought experiment. I also think it has a kind of theological analog in that if you are a theist and you think that God is infinite, you could at least, posit that he has kind of infinite feelings. And maybe I think that there's the possibility here to construct a defense of hell along those lines, in a way that would be thoroughly un-Nozikian. That's a word. In that you could say that because God is an infinite being, when you sin against him, there is kind of an infinite harm being done. That kind of is that would be slightly different to one of the standard ways of supporting hell, which is the idea that, or eternal conscious torment, I should say, which is that you are offending a being of infinite dignity. This would be that you are offending a being of infinite feeling, which I don't know if that's any better. But yeah, so B or A tier, I would say. Okay, next we have the Euthyphro Dilemma. So this is a very old thought experiment in philosophy. Comes from Plato's dialogue, Euthyphro, where the character of Socrates speaks to Euthyphro. So it's a very appropriately named dilemma. And originally, if I remember correctly, this is about piety rather than goodness, although it's largely framed in terms of goodness today. And Socrates and Euthyphro are talking, and the question comes up as to what the definition of piety is. The dilemma is kind of as follows. You have two options for the relationship between the gods and piety. One is that whatever the gods desire is piety, gods define piety in some sense. So if we were to translate this into a monotheistic worldview, which I just think makes things easier, we would say that God defines piety, or God defines goodness. God's will just is goodness, a kind of thoroughgoing divine command theory. The other way of relating God to goodness is to say that God is good, but he's good because his behavior and will matches a type of a kind of definition of goodness that is prior to him. So in much the same way that I would say this table is wooden because my statement bears a kind of relation to the table and is true in virtue of the properties of the table, so too God's will would be good because it corresponds to some other object, which in Plato's philosophy is the forms. So, sorry, Plato actually has a solution to this in the form of the good, because Plato does have gods or demiurges, or a demiurge in his philosophy, but the demiurge doesn't define goodness. It's just a kind of craftsman. It's not the same as the Gnostic demiurge. It's a kind of, perfectly chill demiurge. And it crafts the world and it places objects corresponding to forms, but it does not define goodness. The form of the good defines goodness. Now, this is normally translated into modern terms as a dilemma for people who think that God's will grounds goodness. Well, you say, well, is it that God's will is definitionally good, at which point whatever God commands is trivially moral, even and up to including atrocities and, standardly people point to things like Old Testament massacres in a Christian context? Or is it that God is referencing some further thing which defines goodness, in which case God doesn't define goodness, some further thing does? Now, the most sophisticated Christian solution to this is probably the Thomist solution, which is to say that God's will is downstream of his nature, follows necessarily from his nature, and as a result, because God's nature is good and God's will expresses that goodness, anything that God wills is good, but it's not that God's will is arbitrary. The idea there is that it takes, or the idea partly, I suppose, is that it removes the teeth of situations whereby, or hypothetical situations where God commands atrocities, because it's saying, God's will is not arbitrary. God cannot just change goodness on a dime. I don't know if I'm using that expression correctly, because I kind of don't have a firm grasp of what a dime is. But God's will can't just change arbitrarily or regularly. It flows from his nature definitionally, and so that's meant to take the kind of teeth out of that objection. However, I think that this is a good way to defend it in a classical theist context. I still think that you can then, in a specifically Christian context, ask about things like New Testament massacres and that nature of event, and ask, is this really? Surely this shows that God's will can include things that are pretty grotesque by our normal moral standards. So yeah, I think that this objection or this reply to the Euthyphro Dilemma sort of works, but I think that it is more difficult to use than one might initially expect. Yeah, I think it's a pretty good reply to the Euthyphro Dilemma. However, I do think that it still doesn't give you a positive, full characterization of goodness. However, I also think that that's, if you are a theist who belongs to a particular religious tradition, I suppose you can use scripture to kind of plug in the gap there. But again, it depends on how you reconcile various potential moral tensions within your scripture. I would probably put the Euthyphro Dilemma in the B tier, I think, largely based on vibes rather than anything else. Maybe it's just that it's become so familiar now that it seems less insightful than it actually is. Because it is, imagine that's the first time that you've heard the Euthyphro Dilemma. It's really, really quite cool. And yeah, and I think that the Thoma solution broadly works, but also it leaves a lot unsaid. But my feeling is B tier, and I think that tier lists are always basically just vibe-based, so into the B tier it goes. Okay, next up we have Russell's Teapot, which is, I think that, this is a sort of a legacy of the atheist YouTube and new atheist space that I think that quite a lot of people will have heard of this. Russell's Teapot is initially a thought experiment to do with theism, though I kind of think that it doesn't apply that well to theism, but I think it does apply quite well as a general litmus test for philosophical theories and whether they amount to anything. So Russell's Teapot is a hypothetical teapot that floats around the world, and Russell asks, this teapot is invisible and it's intangible and it can't be measured. And Russell says, disprove the teapot. This is the version that I've heard anyway. Russell says, disprove the teapot. And obviously you can't. There's no way to disprove the teapot. There's no way to prove the teapot, but the teapot doesn't amount to anything. This is normally used as a way to critique God, like the idea that, God is invisible and intangible and doesn't kind of, there's no way of verifying or falsifying him. Therefore, God is like Russell's Teapot, and therefore God is just kind of an inconsequential philosophical proposition. I just don't think that God is like that in most major monotheistic faiths. At least in Christianity, God definitely does things, right? Like God resurrects Christ, and certainly within a lot of major Christian denominations, God does positive miracles. In the Quran, God does stuff. In the Hadiths, God does stuff. I just sort of don't agree with Russell that this is a good characterization of major monotheistic religions. It might be a good characterization of a very, very bare bones kind of theism stroke deism. But even then, the idea, I think, for most bare bones theists and deists is that they're introducing God as the best way to explain certain phenomena. So, I know some people who are bare theists in that they don't belong to any major world religion, and they think there's a God primarily because of the fine-tuning argument. Even then, I disagree with that, obviously. I don't think the fine-tuning argument works, still. But I don't think that is a Russell's Teapot style belief. Because, of course, the God is doing something there. He's explaining the fine-tuning of the universe. And if you were, for example, to discover tomorrow that there's a good reason that the universal constants are a certain way, well then the God would cease to be doing something, right? So you can still have evidence for and against that kind of God. So ultimately, I just don't think the Russell's Teapot is a good characterization of most forms of theism. I'm still not a theist, but I don't find this particularly convincing. However, I do think that Russell's Teapot, it gets at something that I think is quite important for philosophical theorizing more generally, because I kind of loosely fall into the pragmatist tradition of philosophy. And that is that our philosophical theories have to amount to something. I kind of raised this issue with Philip Goff in our conversation, where I was effectively saying that my issue with theorizing about what the nature of the mind is that unless it translates into some kind of observation. So, to give everyone a kind of idea of where we were in the conversation there, Philip and I were talking, and he was saying, look, panpsychism can fit all of the empirical evidence of our neuroscience and psychology, etc., etc., etc. In many ways, it looks pretty much the same as physicalism. And I kind of said, well, if it looks the same as physicalism and it behaves the same as physicalism, then what are these two theories disagreeing about? And that intuition that I have, or that kind of move that I have, I suppose, it's not really intuition in the sense that I was talking earlier, is because I think that philosophical theories should amount to some change in practice, or change in prediction of observation, or change in mental approach, or something like that. And I wasn't convinced that panpsychism had such a change within it. I'm not sure if I'd still think quite that. I'm still not a panpsychist. But yeah, I think the Russell's Teapot is a good way of, it's like a litmus test, right? It's not perfect, but it's a heuristic test that kind of asks you, is there any way that this theory cashes itself out in the world of observation that we all inhabit? And I think if the answer is no, well, maybe there are good reasons independent of that to explore or accept this particular philosophical idea. But at the very least, I think it should give us a pretty good, it serves as a pretty good heuristic that maybe this idea doesn't amount to very much at all. I feel very harsh saying that. But yeah, I do believe that at some point our philosophical theories have to, touch grass and allow us to do things in the world, or predict observations, or navigate our lives better. And Russell's Teapot, and anything analogous to Russell's Teapot, wouldn't allow us to do that. And I think that is a good reason to be suspicious of such theories, even if we eventually think that they're okay for some kind of independent reason. So in terms of tier list placement, I think this is going to go in the C tier, because even though I think that it is handy as a heuristic for philosophical theorizing, I don't think it works for what it seemed to be originally intended to do. And I think that is a kind of point against it. So it's going in the C tier. Okay, next up we have fake barn country. So this is a form of what's called a Gettier case. A Gettier case is a challenge to what's called the justified true belief model of knowledge. What's the justified true belief model of knowledge? Well, it goes back to Plato. Essentially, when interrogating what knowledge was, Plato came up with a pretty good, sound definition that works in almost all cases, which is that a belief is knowledge. Someone has knowledge if they believe something, that belief is true, and that belief is justified. So, paradigmatically, I believe that this copy of Simone Weil's essays is blue on the back. It is true, it is blue on the back, and also I'm justified in believing it because I can see that it's blue on the back. That would be a kind of paradigmatic example of knowledge that is justified, true, and a belief. Edmund Gettier published a series of examples that aim to demonstrate that this did not cover all of our usages of the word knowledge. He has his own examples. I don't think that Fake Barn Country was from him, but it is a Gettier case. We call these examples where someone seems to have a justified true belief, but it doesn't seem to amount to knowledge, a Gettier case after Gettier. Fake Barn Country is a story, effectively. Imagine that you are driving along a country road and you look out of your window and you see a whole bunch of barns, and you see one barn in particular, it's the one nearest to the car, and you say, that is a barn. And you happen to be right, that is a barn, and you're justified because you saw it was a barn. But unbeknownst to you, you happen to be driving through Fake Barn Country, where 99.9% of the barns are fake. You happen to come across the only barn in Fake Barn Country that is real. Now, here you have a belief that, as I said, appears to be justified and true, but nonetheless doesn't seem to amount to knowledge. There seems to be something very fishy about your belief that there's a barn there, or the idea that that there's a barn there, because in the context of Fake Barn Country, doesn't seem like knowledge. It doesn't seem like it's reliable enough to be knowledge. These are the kind of descriptions that people sometimes use when they're trying to kind of bolster their intuition that the Fake Barn case is not knowledge. I think these kind of thought experiments are interesting. I think that they have a interesting part of the history of epistemology is taken up by these thought experiments. I don't find them massively compelling, but that's partly because I am not that interested in looking at necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, like the word knowledge. I think that we should conceive of the word knowledge as a tool that we use to label different types of belief. And I think that justified true belief covers almost all of our usage of knowledge, while leaving some areas out, and also will cover some areas that we don't quite consider knowledge. But I think that those are few enough and far enough between that we can get by on the justified true belief model almost all of the time. And really, when we are stretching this model into very, very extreme and exceptional cases, that is more that the model stops working because the model is best seen as just a very good heuristic as to when we have knowledge. And yeah, sometimes it's going to break down, but I think that's more to do with the fact that we shouldn't expect there to be perfect, necessary, and sufficient conditions for knowledge, just as we shouldn't expect there to be perfect, necessary, and sufficient conditions for a whole number of philosophical terms. When I was being lectured on free will by Professor Richard Holton, who was at Cambridge, he said, made a kind of a series of remarks that always left quite a profound impression on me, which is that philosophers broadly have stopped trying to fully define free will in terms of these necessary and sufficient conditions that cover all our uses of the term free will and free and liberty and stuff like that. It's broadly seen to be that this is kind of barking up the wrong tree now. And instead, our questions turn to things like prototypical cases, exceptional cases, different examinations of special cases, things like addiction. In what sense is addiction free? In what sense is it unfree? This more nuanced style of asking questions. And I think we can just do the same for knowledge. I think that there's no reason to expect that when we say somebody knows something, we're always using the sense of know in exactly the same sense every time we say it. A very, very good example to illustrate this is that, an example to illustrate this that I think crosses over with some independently interesting debates, is that oftentimes atheists and theists will sit down and talk about the evidence for the resurrection of Christ. And oftentimes the theist will say something like, we have as much evidence for the resurrection of Christ as we have for a whole series of other philosophical debates. So half of the interesting events of the Peloponnesian War, we only have one source for. It's Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which is like a phenomenal intellectual achievement, and in many ways like the beginning of how we do history now. Obviously there's Herodotus before him, but like Thucydides just is kind of the GOAT, as they say. Now, the theist, I think, understandably, says, look, we say that all of those events in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, for which we only have that one source, happened. We accept that as historical facts. Why then, when we have all of this evidence from various different historical documents that Christ rose from the dead, why do we not accept that? Now, the atheist, I think, replies by saying, look, all the events in the ancient world are actually fundamentally much more uncertain than we give them credit for. The reason that we say that the events in Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War happened is partly because of the contextual barrier for entry for what we consider to be knowledge in that area. That is, the ancient world, generally, we really lower our standards for when we know something, just because of the paucity of evidence we have at hand. If you had the same evidence we had for many ancient historical events, especially ones in the Peloponnesian War, if you had that amount of evidence for a modern news story, you wouldn't publish it in a newspaper. But because our general evidence base for the ancient world is so sparse, we are just kind of stuck. Basically, if we didn't lower our contextual barrier for knowledge there, we just wouldn't be able to say anything, or we'd be able to say barely anything. As a result, knowledge, when it comes to ancient history, has a much lower barrier for entry than most other scenarios. What happens when these atheists and theists are debating about the resurrection of Christ is they're often caught between two different contextual barriers for knowledge. The contextual barrier for something happening in the ancient world and us saying we know that is really quite low. But the contextual barrier for a piece of information such as the resurrection of Christ that should fundamentally change everything about the way that you live your life, well, that should be very, very high, right? So we have a kind of contextual mismatch where if you're already a believer and you've already kind of bought into this, well, of course you're treating this like any other ancient event. You're going to use those standards. But if you're a non-believer, your standards for when something will count as knowledge is going to be much, much higher, because you're not looking at any old historical event. You're looking at a historical event that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of your life in like every single way, if you kind of are fully committed to it. So I think that that's an example, right, where our definition of knowledge is contextually very different from two different uses of the word know. So yeah, that's not exactly analogous to the Gettier case, but I think it just illustrates that polysemy in our use of the word know is going to be like pretty vast. And as a result, that's why I don't spend too much time looking at these cases whereby the necessary or some proposed necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge are violated by a counterexample or what have you. I think that it's just because I've not set out to create necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, it's just not something that really bothers me. My interests lie elsewhere. Nonetheless, this is a very important historical moment in philosophy, and so despite the fact that it's not really my cup of tea, I'm going to put it in the B tier. Okay, our next thought experiment is the brain in a vat. And this is kind of a complicated one to talk about, because let's just give a kind of how this is usually presented. Is somebody will say, look, this is a variant on a skeptical scenario, right? The idea is that you could be a brain in a vat and you would never know, because everything would appear exactly as it is. But unbeknownst to you, you are and always have been a brain in a vat, experiencing a simulated reality. In that case, it's sort of analogous to Descartes' evil demon and other skeptical scenarios. However, the actual paper that introduces the brain in a vat variant on this isn't a paper in favor of it, or it isn't a work in favor of it. It's a work critiquing it. This comes from Hilary Putnam, and I can't remember if this is a paper or a book. I did read it when I was an undergrad, but it has been a while. And Hilary Putnam's point is that you couldn't have been a brain in a vat. And his argument for this is quite interesting. The actual way that he originally formulates it is quite technical. So I'm going to give like an intuitive gloss that I think gets the kind of general thrust of his point across. Putnam's fantastic and underrated philosopher generally. I think he's brilliant. But yeah, he quite often puts arguments in very technical terms because he's a very precise thinker. But at the same time, I think they often have these kind of intuitive analogues that get the general sense of what he's driving at without all the kind of the technicalia. Essentially, Putnam's point is that our words for things like brains and vats and even things like truth and all that kind of stuff, all of that can only reference things in the world of experience and, within mathematics, things like, the world of maths, the world of stuff that we have encountered, let's say. But we'll stick with the world of experience for now. So let's talk about kind of empirical, experiential truth. Well, the only definition we could have possibly constructed for truth, as in, our kind of empirical, experiential notion of truth, just is with reference to the stuff that we've experienced in the world, right? It sounds really trivial when I put it like that. But the point is that all of our labels have also been constructed merely within this experiential, phenomenal realm, let's call it, to use Kant's terminology. So, when we say that, or brain, or truth, these can only pick out things within the realm of phenomena that we actually have encountered. So, when I say, am I a brain in a vat? The answer to that is that it's false, right? I'm not a brain in a vat, because my word brain and my word vat and the very notion that I'm getting at, which is that everything in my experience could be false, once we realize that in order to make that supposition work, we would have to make the word brain and the word vat and the word true kind of reach out of our experience in some incredibly mysterious way and latch on to these out of experience things of brain and vat and this kind of truth that never impinges on experience. And Putnam's point is, once we realize that, well, then we realize that whatever skeptical scenario we are positing can't possibly be true using the definitions of the words that we have inherited and that we use. If I'm using words like brain and vat and truth in their ordinary sense, then it cannot be that I'm a brain and a vat, and it cannot be that all of my perceptions are false. The very idea is kind of nonsense. Now, Putnam's point is connected very closely to kind of a semantic argument. You can see the way I've kind of presented it there has a semantic touch about it. The thing that I like about his approach, even though his particular argument I think relies on some ideas about the philosophy of language that I would disagree with, is I think basically what Putnam is driving at is that proposing that all of our beliefs are false is basically idle. Because say, I am a brain in a vat, or that all of my beliefs are false in a way that literally will never impinge on my experience, well then, it just kind of doesn't matter, right? It does not affect any of my ordinary usages of statements about the world, because they're about the world of experience, or statements about myself, or statements about truth, because all of these are defined within the realm of experience. And so any idea that they might not correspond to some out of experience world is just idle, right? It's nothing to get het up about. And it's not even clear that we can express this question, because the most we can do is kind of vaguely gesture at some idea that our experience never corresponds to reality. But then the notion of corresponding to reality that we invoke there is so kind of idle. It's so nothing to do with our experience, almost by kind of supposition, right? It has to be totally disconnected from experience for the skeptical scenarios to work. But if that is the case, then it immediately becomes idle. And in Putnam's terms, it immediately becomes unsayable. I'm not sure if I've given the total best explanation of this idea just now, but that's kind of the general thrust of it, is Putnam gives a semantic, quite a sophisticated semantic argument for the idea that we cannot express skeptical scenarios. And I think with that, it's kind of a very technical way of doing justice to the intuition that I think many people have, which is that questions about skeptical scenarios just are idle. Because when we're talking about, is it that my experience never corresponds to anything outside of our experience that we can never get at? Well, kind of, as I say, by supposition, you have stepped outside the realm of utility and verifiability and evidence entirely. So yeah, I think that for me is what Putnam's semantic argument is kind of getting at, which is why I quite like it. And I will put this in the S tier, because I think that it is very, very good. I don't think I've totally done it justice there. But everyone should go and have a crack at the brain of that argument, because it is very, very interesting. And I think that it kind of puts a very erudite and technical gloss and kind of support to this, I think, entirely sound intuition or reaction that people have when confronted with skeptical scenarios, which is that they don't seem to really matter. I think that reaction is correct. I think they don't really matter. And I think that Putnam's argument is one way of kind of semantically expressing this idea. Okay, our next thought experiment is the beetle in a box. This is a thought experiment from later Wittgenstein. And actually, I am, by coincidence, working on a video on later Wittgenstein at the moment. So I'm actually gonna read from my script there, because I've got the actual quote. I have a feeling that if I don't do that, because the beetle in a box thought experiment is kind of fiddly, I will end up kind of getting some detail incorrect, and this is such a hotly contested thought experiment as to what it's actually saying that I think it is worth just reading the quote. The kind of target of this, it's part of a series of arguments and ideas in the philosophical investigations which are intended to attack the notion of a private language. So one way that some people have proposed that we talk about our feelings, like pain and pleasure, is that what we're doing is we are referencing some private sensation that no one else has access to and no one else ever could have access to, and that is where the meaning of our word comes from, essentially. And Wittgenstein's beetle in a box thought experiment is part of a series of arguments which, in my view, at the very least, are intended to destroy this idea of a purely private language, and saying that if that were the case, if that's what the meaning of these terms consisted of, then we would never be able to have any kind of sensible discussion about phenomenology or experience in any way, and that's obviously false. And so it's a kind of reductio under this interpretation of the notion of a private language. And the actual passage from Wittgenstein reads as follows. Now someone tells me that he knows what pain is only from his own case. Suppose everyone had a box with something in it. We call it a beetle. No one can look into anyone else's box, and everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle. Here it would be quite possible for everyone to have something different in his box. One might even imagine such a thing constantly changing. But suppose the word beetle had a use in these people's language. If so, it would not be used as the name of a thing. The thing in the box has no place in the language game at all, not even as a something, for the box might even be empty. No one can divide through by the thing in the box. It cancels out whatever it is. So, for me at least, the beetle here is like an analogue for what our private language talk would be. And in fact, the beetle is even more substantial than what Wittgenstein thinks our private language talk would be if that was indeed if that was indeed what our experience descriptions were trying to do. Because at least here, he says that the beetle as a kind of an empty symbol still does have a place in the language game, and it is external to the person, right? And so the beetle itself is actually more functional than Wittgenstein says our private sensation talk would be. And as I say, this is part of a series of arguments where Wittgenstein is trying to kind of dethrone this particular way of thinking about language, about feelings and sensations. And yeah, the idea is that if our experiential talk were trying to reference these private internal states, then they would be even less substantial than the beetle in the box. And the kind of content of our experience never come into it, etc., etc., etc. So, as a result, since our language about experience doesn't function like that, these words must be amenable to a different kind of analysis. Wittgenstein's point is that private sensation descriptions just cannot do the things that our language about experience does. And as I say, I can't really get into it, but when I finish this video on the later Wittgenstein, and largely Paul Horwich's interpretation of later Wittgenstein, which I think is very, very good, then I'll be able to say, or you'll be able to hear a bit more about it. I think this is very interesting. I think this is an S-tier thought experiment, partly because it is, I think, quite convincingly, together with the other arguments that Wittgenstein gives. This isn't the only argument that he gives, but I think it is quite convincingly with those other arguments from the philosophical investigations, taking a chunk out of what for most people is like their received idea of what our words like pain and pleasure mean. Most people that I talk to or have spoken to, if I were to ask them what they mean when they say pain, they talk about like pointing to this private sensation. I think that Wittgenstein's arguments here and elsewhere just show that this cannot be the full story, and it can't even be a significant part of the story. In fact, by whatever analysis of these terms are, the bulk of it has to do with something public and observable and learnable, right? Because that people have to learn these words, and they cannot be taught sensation terms by pointing to an internal state, because we could not teach someone the meaning of a word with reference to their private internal state, because, like, by supposition, we couldn't get involved in that, right? Because it's private and inaccessible. So yeah, I think this is an S-tier thought experiment. I think it's more convincing in context, because you have all of the other stuff around it. You've got the critique of the kind of purely referential way of talking about linguistic meaning. You've got the critique of like private rules and how that couldn't be sufficient for the. I don't want to say meaningful, because I think Wittgenstein is quite skeptical of a thing called meaning, but I'm going to say it anyway. A meaningful usage of terms and of language. When it comes in that package, I think it's fantastic. It's also just incredibly, like, original. I think that this is a thought experiment where I just can't imagine, if you sat me down for 1,000 years, I would never come up with this kind of thing. So yeah, that's definitely going in the S tier, and I think it is a good example of why Wittgenstein, and especially later Wittgenstein, is so fantastic. As I say, if you want more detail on this, because I have just given like an incredibly surface level gloss of this, do watch my video on later Wittgenstein when it comes out, because we'll be looking specifically at Wittgenstein's critiques of traditional theoretical philosophy, which I think are often ignored, but I think are some of the most impressive parts of his work. You know, things like family resemblance concepts, or cluster concepts, as they're sometimes known now, or the idea of a language game. These are often taken to be concepts in the philosophy of language. In Paul Horwich's reading of Wittgenstein, which I think is really good, they are also ways of undermining a certain metaphilosophical way of looking at philosophy. So yeah, please do stick around for that. I think it'll be really good fun. And yeah, I get the sense that Wittgenstein is someone that people want to learn a lot about, but I don't think there's actually that much out there on him. He's also one of those, like, as in on kind of YouTube, I mean. I think he's also one of those philosophers whereby he's one of the few philosophers in kind of 20th century analytic tradition where he has a kind of interpretive literature that's not like as divergent as the literature around Nietzsche, where people like can't really agree on even very, very basic things about what Nietzsche said or meant. But it is pretty wide, you know, the difference between like Paul Horwich's interpretation and someone like Crispin Wright's, or like the late great Sir Anthony Kenny. A lot of room emerges, and so I think it's kind of worth separating that. So that's why I'm quite excited to do a video specifically on Paul Horwich's interpretation of Wittgenstein, because I think that's a potentially a more helpful way of approaching him, because there is just so much disagreement about what he said. It's for the same reason why I often preface a video on Nietzsche by saying, like, here's my main interpreter for the purposes of this video, to kind of highlight that disagreement at the start. But anyway, yeah, this is going the S tier because I think it's brilliant, and I think the whole series of arguments that Wittgenstein gives together are especially brilliant. Right, next we have John Searle's Chinese room argument. So this is another one of those thought experiments that have been used in a variety of different ways. Sometimes this is pitched to do with language, to do with semantics. Sometimes it's pitched to do with intentionality. Sometimes it's pitched to do with understanding, and sometimes it's pitched to do with consciousness. But I'll run through the thought experiment, and then maybe we can chat a bit more about it. Because I think that as I go through telling it, it will become immediately clear why this thought experiment has had a new lease on life recently. So this is from John Searle, and the general argument goes, imagine that there is a person in a room, and the room has 2 slots in it. In that room, he has a collection of instructions written in English. He's a native English speaker, that let him know how to respond to certain symbols that get put in the box with certain symbols he then pastes outside the box. And he can do this really quickly, right? He's like it's the Flash by stipulation. And unbeknownst to him, because he only speaks English, the symbols he's being posted are Mandarin, and the instructions he's written are the instructions that allow him to imitate a perfect, fluent Mandarin speaker. So, you know, somebody comes along to kind of talk to this Chinese room, and they, you know, write down their statement in Mandarin on a slip, and they put it through, and immediately the room spits back what is in Mandarin a perfectly sensible reply. Now, again, this can be kind of pitched in various different ways. They all get at a certain thing, which is the kind of intuitive reaction that people have that whatever that person is doing inside that box, they don't understand Mandarin. They're not speaking Mandarin as we would normally use the word. or they don't know Mandarin, or their understanding of Mandarin is merely syntactic and not semantic. Like sometimes this is billed as an argument that no amount of syntax can add up to semantics, and as a result, there's a kind of irreducible intentional component to language. So intentional there meaning to do with intentionality or aboutness rather than to do with intentions. So that's another way of putting it. But all of these are largely used in discussions around artificial intelligence. This, I think, initially, when Searle talked about it, he did pitch this as a thought experiment to do with what then was very, very nascent artificial intelligence. I can't remember if this paper's from the 70s or 80s, but it's a long time ago. So working with very, very different ideas. And you can imagine that in its more modern forms, when people have given it, it's often been to do with things like large language models. We touched upon this on a video I did, like a year and a half ago now, on large language models, where I brought this up as an argument that some people use to say that the way that large language models use language is very distinct from the way that people use language. It is a kind of different process. Because when large language models are understanding words and speaking, they are merely kind of mapping syntactic associations between words rather than having a kind of intentionality or aboutness. I kind of don't know what I think about the argument now, because I've become quite skeptical of intentionality and aboutness. I think it reflects a series of assumptions about the world that I think kind of untenable. I think it puts us into this weird metaphysical picture where our words are kind of leaping out and grabbing onto things about the world. We talked about that a bit earlier with the brain in a vat case. So no, I've become very skeptical of that picture of language. I was always a bit iffy about it, but I've become quite firmly skeptical of it. And that has meant that this thought experiment's become like a lot less convincing for me. But it retains a certain prominence in discussions around artificial intelligence, especially in the kind of popular sphere, because it's quite easy to understand. The replies to this are kind of numerous. I'm still kind of puzzling through exactly what I think about it. One suggestion is to say that somebody might say that the person in the room doesn't understand Mandarin, but the room as conceived of as a system understands Mandarin. I think that is literally known as the system's reply. And yeah, this is also tied up with kind of all debates around functionalism and the philosophy of mind and stuff. The trouble with this explaining this thought experiment is that it's been used in so many ways and so many different debates that there are lots of canonical ways of talking about it, and I can't go through them all here. But yeah, so that's one response to which Searle's reply, I think, is to ask us to imagine that somebody has memorized all of the instructions and is just following them kind of syntactically in their head. I think as an argument that syntax and association can never add up to semantics, I don't think this argument does work, because I think that I just think that it relies on a far simpler idea of what association and syntax can be than, for example, when we are learning words as children, where we also do a kind of associative grouping of words and stuff like that. And yeah, I suppose I don't think that the reduction of that process to instructions that associate kind of symbols that are meaningless by themselves is sufficiently analogous to either the way that kind of a future kind of computational intelligence would be trained, or the way that kind of we learn language when we are learning it by association. Obviously, Searle does think that we have, sufficient use of language, sufficient understanding, and so on and so forth. But I do think that we often learn language kind of associatively to do with a kind of inferred rules of practice and things like that, which are kind of analogous to Searle's written instructions within the Chinese room, but are obviously much more complex and work in practice. So I don't find this thought experiment convincing on the whole, but I do like thinking about it because I think that it brings up kind of important questions about how we conceive of things like understanding and speech and the meanings of words. And I would argue that for me, what this thought experiment kind of demonstrates is sort of the opposite to what has often been intended to demonstrate. I think that it shows that in order to get kind of full-blown semantics from associations and syntactic rules and rules of use, we need a much richer characterization of what rules of use are. And of course, because I've later Wittgenstein on my mind, I think that Wittgenstein gives some pretty good characterizations of that in the philosophical investigations. But for me, that's the direction I take the thought experiment, which is totally not how the thought experiment is often used intentionally, and certainly not how Searle wanted to use it. It certainly wasn't his intention when he presented the thought experiment. But I think that it kind of raises these interesting questions. I'm going to put it in the B tier because... No, actually, no. I'm going to put it in the A tier. I'm going to put it in the A tier because I do think that it's very interesting. I just think that it's interesting for different reasons to how it's often presented. I think that it shares a property with a lot of thought experiments that I find unconvincing ultimately, in that I think that it relies too much on our kind of intuitive reaction to a situation, and on the assumption that the situation described is sufficiently analogous to the thing that that situation is trying to represent, which it may have been in Searle's time. I think that it might be in our time. I just don't know enough about the computer science behind large language models. I gave a kind of very basic explanation in my video on it, but I certainly wouldn't consider myself knowledgeable enough to be able to say much about that beyond what I said in that video, which was like a kind of, secondary school level presentation of what a large language model is. And certainly when it comes to kind of future complex systems, I suspect that they will become very, very disanalogous to Searle's case. So that's why I think the thought experiment probably, in my view, doesn't demonstrate what it purports to demonstrate, but I do think it's interesting, independent of the original intentions. That's why I'm going to put it in the A tier. And that is the end of our list. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to watch more of my casual videos, including my paradox iceberg, you can check them out right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.